Hi, welcome to the making of the ballerina moth. She's got a wire armature that's covered with a layer of clay which has been baked as a sort of under armature almost, and then I'm adding the raw clay on top. And I always start at the neck. I can't explain that, I just do. I always start with the neck, and I add clay to the back of her head as well at this point, because when I'm sculpting the face I don't really worry too much about the back of the head, so sometimes it can be a bit flat, a bit messy, but I do find that once the head is added to the body and you've started to sculpt the neck, it's a lot easier to be able to see what shape and size the back of the head should be. As always, I'm adding 2 pieces of clay on either side as I go, trying to add rather than take away most of the time. So 2 equal parts, so it's on each side, so that you never sort of build up one side more than the other and then try and figure out how many pieces you happen to add to the one side that you now need to add to the other side. I did that for many years, so that can be quite a headache. So I'm using my crosshatch technique, which I know a lot of people have always asked me about that. There is no real reason for that, it just feels right to me. It's something that I developed, just it started to happen for no real reason other than it's comfortable for me. I find it sort of almost like a drawing. It feels like I'm drawing in clay. So I'm still just carrying on adding more clay to the chest, building up the rib cage and the stomach as well. This will all be covered because she is going to be a ballerina moth. I decided to sculpt her bodice. I would love to be able to use fabric to make a bodice, but up until now I haven't mastered the technique of making fabric or adding fabric. I do for skirts but not for the bodice. I always end up going back to clay because I always find that it's easier. I'm able to do it much easier than trying to figure out fabric, but some people can do some amazing fabric bodices and clothing in general. I added most of the body all in one go, so I sculpted most of this one all in one go because it is again like quite a simple pose, so there's no areas that are going to be really difficult to get into that you need to sort of set what you've already done so you can move on. I just did it all in one, and I'm just adding 2 pieces on either side of the body, just building it up. She actually started because my mother-in-law gave me some earrings that are little balls, that sort of caged balls that had a semi-precious stone inside, because she said to me, can you use these in your work, which I mean was really sweet and kind. And I immediately thought of using them as some kind of decoration in the hair, because I love putting ornate decorations in the hair. Because she's a moth, I always do try to, well, have done in the past, sort of make my moths have kind of a fantasy kind of body type, because the hips are always quite wide in relation to the waist. They're a little bit wide because I imagine her being a moth, and I sort of think about these segmented bodies, and I feel like that's something that maybe would sort of reflect that a little bit or suggest that a little bit. So she does have, as they all do really, has a bit of a wider hips in comparison to the size of her waist. So I'm just building up the back the same way I did the stomach, where I'm adding pieces of clay on both sides, sort of where the muscles would be on the back. And for the breasts, I add them last. I always do this really. I sculpt most of the chest first and then add the breasts afterwards. And for that I take 1 piece of clay, divide it in half, then take those 2 pieces of clay and make sort of teardrop shapes, and then add them and blend them into the chest. It's always hard to know where the knee actually is on the leg, and so I always just try to do a piece of clay so I can remember where the knee is on the leg. And of course sometimes if you've got 2 legs that are not in the same pose, it can be quite difficult to get make sure that the knees are in the same place on both legs. One thing I like to do is use a piece of string. That can be very helpful so that you can measure on one leg and make sure that the other knee cap is in the same place. Same goes for the arms. It's a good way to measure is using a piece of string. So I'm just carrying on using my crosshatch technique to blend in the clay on the legs. Yeah, I got most of this figure done all in one go. So it always helpful that, because you can make sure that the pose is right. If you've baked some sections, then it just makes it a little bit harder. It can potentially make it a little bit harder to make sure that your pose is exactly what you want, because once obviously something's baked you can't really bend it anymore, but you can scrape back, so it's never the end of the world. I'm not quite sure what she was supposed to be doing. Maybe she was thinking about something with her mouth half open and her finger sort of on her mouth. So then after I've got everything to where I wanted, I use my mineral spirit, or sometimes it's called white spirit, on a brush, and I use a few different brushes to just smooth out all of those millions of sketch lines. You have to sort of go through a few different brushes, because the first brush will smooth out the sketch lines, but because that brush is quite rough, it will leave its own set of marks that you then have to go and smooth out with another brush. So she had her first bake. As you can see, there are areas where I've sort of marked where the clothing will go. So making sort of marks into the clay like that, where the clothing, like the sleeve of the clothes, will go, can help because it presses into the clay like it would do if you had a piece of fabric on your skin. It looks like something is pressing on the skin, if that makes sense. Once I had most of the bodice built up, I decided to give her a moth, of course, on the front of her bodice. I drew out the picture of the moth onto a piece of tracing paper, and pencil is really good at coming off on raw clay. So you do it, obviously you've got to do it the opposite way, because you turn it over and then press it onto the clay, and then you've got a nice basic outline to work on top of. And this is the fun part. I really enjoy doing the funny little details like this. And then some more details, because of course I always have to make my life really difficult with a whole lot of fiddly bits, which take hours and hours. So I wanted to give her sort of frilly bits on her bodice, and so I just used some clay for that. And then I added her feet and her shoes and her ballet-like shoes. They weren't real ballet shoes. I suppose you might call them pumps, and they had to have the same detail as the bodice. So that was some more work for me. And the fun part, making the ballet shoes at the bottom. All of the little gathers of the leather that was used on the ballet shoes, or satin, whichever one they were. And the little stitches, of course, as well. Then I used some gold embossing powder just to add some extra shine to the details on the bodice. And now this is me packing it into the oven. So I'm laying her on some cotton wool balls, putting some cotton wool balls over the top of her so that the hot air is not directly hitting her. And then she would have been baked. It won't be the last bake, so it'll probably be about 40 minutes. And then I carried on. So sometimes it's good to do that, because then you can touch everything that you've already done and you don't squish something while carrying on to build the next bit. I sculpted her some pantaloons for underneath her tutu, and so I'm adding some embossing powder and some paint onto the bodice again of her tutu. And then of course she had to have wings because she's a moth, so I used some light clay, so it's Sculpey Ultralight, and I used some wire to make sure that it was firm. And then moving on to her hair, I wanted to dye her hair, so I used some viscose fiber and some dye that is good for synthetic fibers. I can't remember what it's called actually. If I remember, or if I can look into it, I will leave it in the description below. And I use that, apply the dye and leave it to dry, then rinse it out, and then it is ready to be used. And then comes the painstaking task of adding eyelashes, which is add one by one. I must say I find it quite therapeutic, but it is very long-winded. It can take you half a day. You wouldn't think so. For the eyelashes I use real human fake eyelashes. I always choose the ones that have taper on the end so that they don't have that harsh sort of end, and I use tacky glue to glue them in place. She has nice holes in the side of her head, to which I glued some wire so that her hairstyle could stay firm and in place. And then of course adding the decorative ball on the ends of her sort of, what would you call them, ponytails? I'm not sure they're ponytails. They're more like sort of decoration, hair decoration. I'm not quite sure what you would call it. Thank you to all my patrons on Patreon for supporting me. I really appreciate every one of you. If you'd like to join me on Patreon, I'd be so happy to welcome you into my studio. I'm currently uploading 1 hour of sculpting tutorials each month at patreon.com/Renata Jansen. There are hundreds of videos on there for you to watch. You can join for less than $2 per week. We've just finished sculpting the salty mermaid in a teacup, and I've posted the first part of sculpting the absinthe fairy for this month. I'd love to see you there. You can also sign up for my mailing list for free by clicking on the link in the video description. Everyone who signs up gets a free in-depth sculpting a nose tutorial. So thank you so much for watching. Subscribe and click on the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Thank you. See you again soon.